Hey, welcome to another episode of Indie Authors. I'm your host, Jason Matthews. With us, as usual, is my beautiful co-host, the multi-talented, multifaceted, multi-dimensional Marla Miller. Marla, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure always.
And we have a real treat coming all the way from London, England. Joanna Penn is with us. Joanna has an accolade list that is way too long for me to go through in 20 minutes, so we're just going to introduce her as an author, an international speaker, and entrepreneur. She was recently voted as one of the top 100 professionals in the UK by The Guardian. She's an author of both fiction and nonfiction, and she also teaches authors what she knows. Her website is The Creative Pen with two N's.com. Joanna, it's a real pleasure having you here with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's always lovely to chat across the pond as such.
Across the pond, that's what Marla and I always say. Let's get right into it because we have more questions than we have time to ask, but you write fiction and nonfiction. What are the main differences when you're writing these two? And as a follow-up question, what are the main differences for your marketing?
Yeah, well, I think writing fiction is, I think, a lot harder than writing nonfiction. So the nonfiction I've written has been based out of what I already know and can study and can create. And because I was a business consultant for 13 years, I think when you work in business, when you work in a, I guess a normal job, unlike this job, you get used to writing long documents about stuff. So I found when writing nonfiction, it was just a case of, I want to write a book on this, and these are my chapters, and then fill in the blanks. Whereas right now, I'm struggling with a book called Delirium, which will be a murder mystery, crime thriller type thing, follow up to Desecration, which is out. And writing a murder mystery is like you have to make up so much stuff and kind of organize it so well and put clues everywhere. And so I find it an incredibly different skill set to write fiction. Like dialogue, for example. Who writes dialogue in any other job? Apart from writing fiction, it just doesn't really happen. So I think that you almost have to learn to write all over again when you write fiction. But I certainly find it to be incredibly rewarding. Well, both kinds actually. And I also find writing nonfiction like cleans the palate in between fiction books. So yeah, I guess that would be my sort of differences in writing anyway.
And in terms of I actually have a question about fiction versus nonfiction, Joanna, and in terms of grabbing fictional techniques to make your nonfiction pop even more. Has writing fiction made you a better nonfiction writer?
That's good. It's a good question because, of course, you're right. A lot of popular non-fiction books now are using techniques of the fiction writer. So, for character being a good one. Like you can't just write, technical blurb. You have to, even if the character is yourself, you have to include stories within a non-fiction book to illustrate your points. So you're absolutely right. There are definitely. I still think you don't use dialogue in general.
Indeed.
But no, I think you're right. I think that let's face it, any type of writing, if it's blogging, I think blogging for 5 years has enabled me to become a fiction writer. So I think for both of, I think it's helped me develop a voice and to be more confident that in speaking, writing in my own voice, people will like me, like what I'm saying.
Sure.
And also change my writing from a business language to actually something people want to read, which is what your point is. I think that you have to have story hooks and things within non-fiction, otherwise people will just be like, this is terribly boring.
Exactly. And then just as a follow-up, which Jason already asked, but in terms of marketing, Joanna, some differences maybe between the two that you found?
Definitely. Like one massive one is writers of non-fiction do not make up some clever book title. It must be based on SEO keywords and preferably keywords that you found on Amazon through using the drop-down search bar to actually, find the best title. So I have a book out now. It's called Public Speaking for Authors, Creatives, and Other Introverts. Now that title it's quite descriptive, but it's also very SEO keyword rich. So
Gotcha.
that would be like the #1 thing. And obviously you can't do that with fiction. You can't SEO your fiction book title, but you can use that in the keywords. So that's a really big,
it's a good tip.
yeah, a big thing. Oh, I see. Is Jason's actually showing my
Yeah.
book? How sweet!
Yeah.
That's lovely.
Let's yes.
Oh yeah.
This is your Amazon book. This is
Let's take a look.
Public Speaking for Authors, Creatives, and Other Introverts. Now,
Great title.
how many people are I know that that's very keyword rich, maybe except for the introverts part, but this is a really smart
it's
book.
interesting.
Now, this just came out a month ago. Isn't that right?
That's very true, because I speak a lot and I am an introvert. People ask, but there's a great book by Susan Cain called Quiet, and since that the word introvert has become far more mainstream, which is one of the reasons I've written the book, is for people who love Susan Cain. It will actually, it will work for them. So yeah. So anyway, the keyword thing is really important for book titles. And then for fiction, I think the biggest thing with fiction, blogging, guest posting, all of the stuff around keywords anywhere is important for non-fiction. But for fiction, I think the best way to sell fiction books is to be on these sites, on Amazon. So for example, I use BookBub. We should say there that is, I have 2 brands, so that's Joanna Penn, and my fiction
this is just for non-fiction. I need to go to JF Penn for your fiction.
I split my brands. We can talk about that if you like. But yeah, so marketing fiction, I think, is much more about getting, book reviews, getting, getting your algorithm sorted, getting the right category, a lot of the stuff that you actually do on the site. And then paid promotion can often really help, building a email list, that type of thing. Fiction, I think, is a lot different to non-fiction.
Let's talk about that, because you have 2 different brands. You have a brand for your fiction. You have a brand for your nonfiction, and that's very interesting, because I think a lot of authors need to make this decision. Now, I've done the same thing, but I haven't changed brands. And let me share your fiction brand. Whoops, this is giving me. Okay, this is JF Penn, who is obviously still Joanna Penn, but this is JF Penn, the novelist, the fiction writer. So we have One Day in Budapest, Pentecost, Desecration. All of your novels are here, and you have chosen to keep the fiction and nonfiction separate. That must be a challenge to manage 2 brands.
That is true. I would say it's a nightmare. Now, the reason why is because, as I said, I started out as not writing nonfiction and as Joanna Penn, the creative Penn, as a speaker, as a teacher, I guess, and as this kind of happy, smiley, helpful girl, which is totally me. It's absolutely me. But the creative Penn, the brand of the creative Penn, I've been blogging there for over 5 years. I am that kind of happy, smiley person. My fiction, when I started writing fiction only 3 years ago now, my fiction is very dark. There's, ritual murders and sex and dark stuff and bodies, and the book Desecration, I mean, the title says it all, really. So what I wanted to do with that, and I have 2 websites as well, is JF Penn is a dark, sort of twisty girl, and I wanted to, even though both of those characters are me, I needed to keep my Amazon, people who shop on Amazon or Kobo or iBookstore, the people who want to read Public Speaking for Introverts don't necessarily want to read Desecration. So for me, it was really a case of I'd need to keep these 2 separate, and that works for me. And they're both separate businesses, so I make money from fiction and then I make money from non-fiction speaking. So that works for me, but I do advise other people to think very carefully about splitting your brands in such a way.
Yeah, I think that one of the criticisms, or one of the things that I've heard about doing the 2 brands, is that in the indie publishing world, because having several books is a good thing, as opposed to only having one. If you're separating your brands, then people aren't getting to see all of you in one click. So I wonder what you think about that.
Oh, that's totally true. And I think if I hadn't have built up a business under the creative pen,
okay.
I probably wouldn't have done this. It's just that the fiction came second. That voice is very different. I have had quite a lot of the creative pen audience are authors. JF Penn audience are fans of Stephen King. So it's a very different grouping. So for me, it works. I think if people write erotica and children's books, they need two brands. But
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So there's probably occasions when yes, having two brands is a really good idea. But that doesn't mean you need, like, for example, Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter at the Creative Pen, and I can't maintain more than one profile on Twitter, so I just use at the Creative Pen for everything. And I use different sites. So Pinterest, I only have JF Pen.
Gotcha.
So I do different things on different sites depending on my brand. But yeah, it's a hell of a lot of management,
isn't it? Though. Yeah.
Now, I have to apologize, Joanna, because I interrupted you earlier when we were talking about your latest nonfiction book, Public Speaking for Authors, Creatives, and Other Introverts. This is obviously for authors who want to do public speaking. Can you give us a couple tips for authors who want to speak more?
Yeah, well, the big one I would say is, why authors should be learning to speak is that we all want to plan for success, right? I mean, and professional, well, not I say professional, successful authors have to speak. They get asked to even do stuff online. They get asked to speak at conventions. They'll get asked to speak at bookstores, do readings. All of this type of thing happens when your books start to sell. So it's a really good idea to actually start speaking within your own comfort zone before you get asked to do these bigger things. So that would be one reason. Two, for me, I think as a full-time author entrepreneur, having speaking income is also really, really good. So I'm actually a paid speaker. So if authors want to do this full-time and are struggling to make the money just from the books, it's a really good extra thing. But then in terms of like my number one tip, it is to get over yourself.
Amen.
because so often we're like, oh, but what do people think of me and what I look like or what I sound like, or do I sound like an idiot, or people won't like me. And actually at the end of the day, like for our books, nobody cares about us. They care about what they are getting out of the experience. So I think if you remember that all the time, the customer is God and the reader is God and the listener is God, then we can just get over ourselves and try and be helpful or entertaining or whatever.
That is such an important tip. I have learned time and time again. It's so easy as an author to talk about ourselves, to make it about us, to try and have people relate to our experience. But we need to shift to the focus is on them. It's all about you. That should be the attitude. It's all about you, and then they'll get so much more out of it, and they'll want to know, what else have you got to teach me about myself?
One of the, if I can just add this, I teach at a community college here, and because writers tend to be such introverts, and back in the old days we used to have public speaking courses that they could go to just to get over themselves. And what I do in my workshop, Joanna, is I make them do a 3-minute YouTube video before the class is over, and I make them do that, and then we share it in the workshop. And I will tell you something, that there's probably very few teaching tools that I've used that have been that effective. Writers are petrified of seeing themselves, but if you see yourself enough, just go to YouTube and hang out there alone. If you see yourself enough on the video, you will get over yourself eventually, so that you can then go to that next level, which is talking about your brand. Not about you and how you look, but about what we're doing right now, talking about the community of writing. But it really does take some climbing, doesn't it, for most authors?
Oh, yeah. And I think the important thing as well, like if authors are wondering about selling books, for example, and marketing, if you can speak, even if it's just, on video or in person, you stand out above probably 90% of other authors who refuse to speak.
Indeed.
It's amazing how many people will say no to opportunities because they're so worried. And I do cover anxiety in the book, but the point is I still feel you know, sick, and I still have to go to the toilet a lot before I speak. And the other thing about being an introvert, yeah, and that's fine. You just do that, you know, you just do that thing. And the other thing about being an introvert is you get very drained. So I'm actually
3, 2, 1, and we're live. And okay, so this is the creativepen.com. And Joanna mentioned that she's been blogging for about 5 years, and maybe longer than that. I know that her blog is important to her. She's very active on YouTube with podcasts. She does Skype interviews regularly. Joanna, can you tell us what are basically some of the most important social media elements of your marketing routine?
So I think when I think about marketing now, I think about it as kind of the rest of my life that isn't the writing bit. So like you mentioned there, so I have a blog. So the Creative Pen is a blog, as in every 2 or 3 days I have some content up there. So that will be either a text post, a video post, so I have a YouTube channel as well, or I just posted today the latest podcast, and that goes out on iTunes as an audio podcast, and also is on the site as an audio and as a blog post with show notes. So I have a kind of multimedia content strategy, and that allows me to do 2 things. One, build relationships, you know, like we're doing here, by actually speaking for a bit of time. You get to know people better than you would do if you just do a text interview. So I'm on episode 176 of my audio podcast, and all of those people over the years have been amazing. So that's a big part of my strategy, is podcasting. And then I also, when I interview people like you guys, I do it on a YouTube video, so I use the same content multiple times. So that's kind of my home has that on, and JF Pen, I also do have a blog as well. And then from there, I then share that content on the social media sites. So Twitter is my #1 social media. Yeah, absolutely. I love
mine
Twitter
too. I love it.
I love it. Yeah, it's amazing. And I tell you what, most of my friends that I've made in the author world, I've made on Twitter, and pretty much all my podcasts come from Twitter. You're
amazing,
the same,
Joanna. Yes, I mean, I'm shifting because I'm loving Twitter, and I'm shocked that I'm loving it. But most of my business associations coming from Twitter.
Exactly. And I mean, I've got 85% of my audience is from the US, even though I'm in the UK.
Good.
And most of that is you know, driven by Twitter. I schedule a lot. So if people go on Twitter and go, she's on there 24/7, I use, what do I use? Buffer app. To schedule most of my sharing, and I share 80% other people's content and 20% approximately of my own content. So, and then I have you know, I use all the other social media, but not as much as Twitter. So realistically, I would say my strategy is create great content that is useful to people, then in multimedia formats, so that it reaches all kinds of different audience. Do a really good SEO headline, which a lot of authors get really wrong, and then I share that on social media, and that's pretty much what I have done for 5 years.
Joanna, now you're originally Australian. Is that true?
No, I'm British.
Oh, you're British. Okay, excuse me.
Yeah, that sounds real UK to me.
But you have lived in Australia, haven't you?
Yeah, I lived in New Zealand for 7 years, and Australia for 4 years. Yeah.
Okay, that's where the confusion came in. Sorry about that. What are some of the unique challenges for authors who are either living in the UK or maybe they're Australian? Because I know that Amazon.com, the U.S. market, is really still the lion's share of sales for most ebooks. So how much does that factor into your writing? Do you write for an American audience, or do you ever think about that, or even just the way the differences in spellings, things like that? Does that play into it at all?
Yeah, I've always aimed for the American market because it's so much bigger than everywhere else. So, you know, you guys have like 280 million people or something, and we have 60 million in England and 20 million in Australia. So, yeah, and my books all have American spellings, actually, as well. I don't even have a UK. Yeah, but as I said, I've always aimed to market to the American audience. The other reason why is you guys are a couple of years ahead, possibly 18 months now, of the UK. But in terms terms of internet adoption, Kindle adoption, ebook adoption, happiness to buy online. The Americans have been buying online much longer than everybody else, but I would caution Americans at this point in history, because what we're now discovering is the American ebook market is still, you know, growing as such, but it's already at 50% or something. The ebook market in a country like Germany, for example, is only at 10%.
Wow.
Now, so there's a lot more room for growth in Europe and the Far East. In fact, there's a lot more room for growth in every other country in the world than there is in America now. So I'm obviously now still trying to sell to Americans, and I will continue to write for Americans, but I've also got 5 books coming in translation this year, German, Italian, Spanish, working to look into those markets. I'm now interviewing on my blog people from India, you know, people from all different countries, because I really see, because we're in this for the long haul, right? This is not a short-term career. So I figure we know what to do with the American market. You know, we have our routine for how to sell books in America. So what we need to know now, what we need to learn now, is how do we sell books in Germany? How do we sell books in China? In India? There are more English speakers in India than there are pretty much in the whole of Europe. And they're all educated, book-reading Indians, the ones who speak English. And China and, you know, South Korea, for example, amazing, mature market. Japan, these are countries. Russia, 3rd biggest ebook market in the world. We haven't even started there. So yes, I'm totally pro selling books to Americans, but I think the big swing in income is going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years, probably. I don't think most authors are going to make more money than they do in the US in the next 1 year, but it's going to change. So last November I sold books in 30 countries through Kobo and iBookstore. Amazon doesn't split their sales down any further than the actual stores, but 30 countries was awesome. So yeah, that's kind of my rant about the global market, because I think it's so exciting and so many people are not seeing it yet.
Well, you know, I just have to jump here and just give this shout out to all of our listeners, that what Joanna just did for the last couple of minutes was she talked about the entrepreneurial aspect of writing, and she has her eye on the future, which is what entrepreneurs must do. And it sounds to me like not only do you have your eye on the future, but you're trailblazing that. So if anyone is interested in figuring out how to get their books into the European market, I'm going to be following you, Joanna, and I'm going to be, you know, clicking onto every blog that you offer about that, because you're so right. And yet so many writers, we don't have that vision. We just don't have it yet. We're getting there. But that was just very entrepreneurial, what you said, and I really liked it.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, you know, I get so shocked by people thinking that they've just written one book, because of course it's not one book. It's one book times the, you know, print, ebook, audiobook, and then times the number of countries that you can publish in, which we're up to like 51 countries now, times the languages that you can publish in. So suddenly one book becomes, you know, lots and lots and lots of books. And then each book you put out, you need to be looking at how do you multiply the rights. And as indies, of course, we don't want to sell all our rights. We want to sell some of our rights, but do not sell world rights to all languages, which some people seem to be doing. It's just crazy in all formats. So yeah, think about those things. And I do have some posts on my site that go into this, and some interviews. So I'll let you know.
I will be following you now, girlfriend. Absolutely.
In fact,
absolutely.
I wish we had more time, Joanna.
I do too.
We are getting low on time, but we'd love to have you back in the future. We've got many, many more questions we could ask today. But
well, I mean, the first book's coming out in German in be April, May, so I could come back on later this year and tell you how that's gone.
That'd be fantastic.
That sure would. I'd love it.
Like to remind our audience, of course, she's Joanna Penn, international speaker, author, entrepreneur, so many wonderful things, sharing information. She teaches, she coaches, she writes dark thrillers. Check out her books at Amazon or go to thecreativepenn.com. Follow her on Twitter.
Indeed.
Again, Joanna, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on the show. Thank you.
Okay.
Fun.
I'm Jason Matthews. She's Marla Miller. This has been another episode of Indie Authors. Thanks very much for joining us, and come back and see us again sometime.
Thank you both.